Washington Journal continues.
Joining us for a discussion on the Trump administration's climate agenda, two guests. We're meeting Bob Deans with the National Resources Defense Council. He serves as their Director of Strategic Engagement. Also, Myron Ebell of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's the Director of their Center for Energy and Environment. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Victoria, we talk about the larger issues of the agenda. Talk about specifically something called the Paris Climate Agreement. As we speak right now, the Trump administration is debating on whether to stay in it. Could you give not only what it is, but your perspective on if it should stay in, if the U.S. should stay in it or not? Mr. Deans.
Sure, Pedro. This is a triumph of American leadership. We're doing what's right for our country here at home, cutting carbon pollution today so our children don't inherit dangerous climate change tomorrow. And we got the entire world on board. 195 countries in Paris agreed with the United States. Let's cut our fossil fuel use. Let's shift to cleaner, smarter ways to power our future. Let's create a brighter future for our children. That is a huge triumph. So why on earth would we walk away from that success? Why would we break our promise to the rest of the world and leave our children to pay the price? We need to stay with it.
Mr. Ebell?
The Paris Climate Treaty is exactly the opposite of what Bob said. It is not a triumph. It is taking the world in the wrong direction. It is incredibly expensive, both for this country and for other countries, including developing countries, and it will have no perceptible effect on global temperatures. So it's all pain and no gain, and that's why President Trump campaigned on the promise to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Treaty.
As far as this debate took place in the pages of USA Today, a couple points were made. I'm going to shoot them to the opposite of the point being made. Here's the first point, Lisa, the editor, saying that reneging on such a far-reaching and historic pact would damage America's credibility and erode diplomatic relations with countries that have taken their environmental promises far more seriously. How would you respond to that, Mr. Ebell?
Well, first of all, other countries are not taking their promises so seriously. There was a study out last week that said that only 3 European Union countries are on target to meet their commitments. The United States also is not on target. The commitment made by the Obama administration only gets us to about 55% of our commitment. So President Trump has said we're going to remove some major pieces towards that are part of that commitment, and we're not going to add any more to it. So we will never fulfill our commitment, and I think that is really why we must withdraw from the Paris Climate Treaty.
Mr. Deans, I'll read you a statement from Chris Horner, who is a colleague at the Competitive Enterprise Institute about it. He says this, saying, climate catastrophe, no computer model cited by the United Nations projects a detectable temperature reduction from Paris. The ultimate aim of the agreement is instead make the most abundant energy increasingly costly, artificially rationing availability.
Oh my goodness, that's ridiculous. We know from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the gold standard, what's happening here. We just wrapped up the hottest year since global record keeping began in 1880. For the third year in a row, we broke the record. Of the 17 hottest years on record, Pedro, 16 have all occurred in this century, and we know what it's causing. Rising seas, croplands turning to deserts, mass extinctions, the worst since the dinosaurs died. The Great Barrier Reef is dying. We know what's happening. We know the reason. It's because we're burning too much fossil fuels. And we've put so much fossil fuel pollution in the atmosphere, we've actually put more than 43% more carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. That has thrown a heat blanket over the globe. It's causing climate chaos worldwide. We know what we need to do about it. 195 countries are in agreement on that. We need to move forward with it.
So you've heard some of the perspective from our guest. We want to hear from you as well about the agenda for climate in the Trump administration. If you want to ask our guest questions, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and 202-748-8002 for independents. Aside from as the specific Paris Agreement and what happens if whether the decision is made, there was a meeting that was supposed to take place at the White House about whether to consider even joining. That meeting was canceled. It's set to be rescheduled. Did that send a message as far as what the administration might be doing in this case?
If it does, I don't know what it is. I think it was reported that some people were traveling who wanted to be in the meeting, so senior people were traveling with President Trump. So I think that there are two factions in the administration. I would call them the promise keepers and the promise breakers. They're fairly evenly balanced. I think the president made a very strong commitment during the campaign. He made it several times. It's part of his whole energy an environmental package. It's an integral part of it to pull out of the Paris Climate Treaty. So I think the president is for pulling out, but I think the administration is divided.
At the end of the day, do you think the president will go forward as far as pulling out?
I think he will keep his commitment and he will withdraw from the Paris Climate Treaty.
Mr. Deans, do you think the same?
No, Pedro. We think the president's going to recognize that we're making real progress here. We've cut our carbon footprint in this country 14% since 2005, while our economy has grown 17%. And here's how we're doing it. We're doubling down on efficiency so we do more with less waste. We're building in this country some of the best all-electric and hybrid cars anywhere in the world, and we're getting more clean power from the wind and sun. That has created jobs for 3 million Americans, and this is only the beginning. Because of this global nature of this historic shift away from dirty fossil fuels, we're going to see $7 trillion in global investment. We need our workers to succeed for that global sweepstakes. This is the economic play of our lifetime, and worker success for Americans begins right here in our own country.
So let me weave in some calls. This first one is from Michael from Illinois, Independent Line. You're on with our guest, Michael. Go ahead.
Hi. I got 2 points. Number one, I've been noticing and I'm objecting to the fact that when you have on someone who is acknowledging the settled science that climate change is taking place, you always bring on somebody who's going to counter the argument and confuse the issue. That's my first point. The question is this. The U.S. military has been planning for climate change and the social implications of that for more than 20 years. If the military believes that this is happening, why do we still have these naysayers? And I voted for Trump, but he's not getting my vote the second time around because he doesn't know what he's doing, quite frankly. So that's what I want to know. The military prepares for this, and these naysayers just keep going on. Thank you very much.
Okay. Who wants to start?
Well, I will say, Michael, that I think you're one of many Americans who did not vote, whatever we voted for in November. People didn't vote for dirty air and dirty water. We didn't vote to hobble the Environmental Protection Agency, take our environmental guardian off the beat. And we certainly didn't vote to walk away from American climate and clean energy leadership, millions of jobs, and leave our kids to pay the price. That's not what we voted for. It's not what we expect, and we hope the president will see the rationale in that. But certainly the military has been preparing for this because we're seeing deserts turn, croplands being turned to deserts in Somalia, in China, in Kenya, in Kansas. And it is a national security issue. The Pentagon long ago recognized that, as did the Central Intelligence Agency. And this is a serious issue. We need to deal with it by cutting our fossil fuel consumption and shifting to cleaner, smarter options.
Mr. Ebell.
The U.S. military, like all government agencies, is always looking for to expand their portfolio and their funding. I would like to know what they've actually done to plan for so-called catastrophic climate change, because in fact, contrary to Bob, U.S. food production and global food production continues to go up. And part of the reason is because the planet is greening as a result of higher carbon dioxide levels. So these disasters that are predicted for the future are entirely speculative. The actual data we have suggests that the things that we depend upon, like food, are in good shape. What the threat is from all this entire agenda is the threat to affordable and abundant energy. There are over 1 billion people in the world who don't have electricity. They are not going to get it very quickly if they're going to get the most expensive forms of energy. They're going to get it from fossil fuels, coal-fired power plants, natural gas-fired power plants. That's what people in India, for example, are, and parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia are really dreaming of, is to join our kind of standard of living and benefit from modern technology and energy.
Minnesota, Democrats line, Vicki, hi.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Myron. Oh, Bob, I'm
Vicki.
so on your side. Living in Minnesota and growing up here for 61 years, I grew up on the lakes and all the streams. We have such a beautiful state, and you can see what all the chemicals and the pollution is doing to it. I think the only reason we don't go farther in protecting our environment is because of the big industries. It's all about the bottom dollar. We know that. That pipeline coming through in Dakota's next door to me, and partly through here, it's very upsetting. I was in science and biology and chemistry, and you send us to school to get smart and study and come and tell the world better ways to live, and you don't listen to us. We need to stop the pollution. Thank you.
Mr. Ebell, why don't you start?
I'm against pollution, but I'm against limiting the world's ability to deal with pollution by making us poorer. The fact is, carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. It's a naturally occurring trace gas necessary for life on Earth. The data is, not the model predictions, the data. Bob talks a lot about everything going up. In fact, the rate of warming is so much lower than what the models have predicted that I think it calls into question the entire project. We have seen for the last 20 years a very slow rate of warming that is about 1/3 to 1/2 of what was predicted by even the lowest models. So I think we have there's a confusion here between environmental protection and limiting pollution and this whole global warming regime. And I agree with your caller. The global warming agenda is really about empowering and enriching the climate industrial complex. There are very major companies and very wealthy people who are benefiting, who are making billions of dollars and hope to make hundreds of billions of dollars off the backs of taxpayers and consumers all around the world.
Mr. Deans.
Boy, you know, Pedro, your viewers are watching something historic. Nowhere else in the world would this conversation even be taking place, and right here on Capitol Hill. They are not arguing about climate change anymore in Beijing, London, Los Angeles, not even Lagos. Everybody in the world understands the problem. Everybody in the world understands the difference, and I know Myron does too, between the CO2 that I breathe and the industrial carbon pollution that has literally changed the chemistry of the global atmosphere. Everybody understands that, yes, I put out heat, but I'm not a smelting furnace. So there's a big difference between that. And everybody understands the opportunity we have right now to shift to cleaner, smarter ways to power our future. And I'm moved by Vicki's remarks about the lakes out in Minnesota. Under the plan that the administration has put forward, the proposed budget would end a program that is cleaning up the Great Lakes, the largest surface freshwater system in the Western Hemisphere. Those Great Lakes are dying from industrial contamination, municipal waste, invasive species. This administration wants to put an end to the program that's cleaning up the Great Lakes. Why would you do that? 86% of the people who live out in Vicki's region, the people in Wisconsin, in Ohio, in Michigan, support that program. That's a mistake. We need to protect the Great Lakes.
Mr. Ebell, what about these potential cuts to the EPA budget that could exist, or at least were projected in the president's early release of his budget?
Yes, I think that the EPA budget cuts that have been suggested, of course, they're going to be debated in Congress, and so this is probably not going to get all that the president has requested. But I think that the EPA is an agency that is overstaffed, and that it's also overregulating the economy. And I think one of the reasons President Trump won the election is he made that point very forcefully in the heartland states, which are the states that have suffered economically. Bob talked about economic growth. Well, the economic growth that we've seen for the last 15 years has been the managerial class, the financial class, what I would call the bicoastal urban elite. It's bypassed places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana. Those states are hurting, and President Trump said, I think that one of the reasons is because of the regulatory rampage that EPA has been conducting. That resonated with people there because they've seen it. So I think if we have a shrinking of the EPA, we'll have less capability in the EPA to overregulate the economy.
You were part of the president's transition team at the EPA.
Yes.
The director, Scott Pruitt, were you part of the choice as well for him to become director, and what do you think of the performance so far?
Well, I was head of the EPA transition team for the agency. Personnel was a separate silo. I'm pleased with Scott Pruitt. I think he's a good choice, but I didn't have anything to do with picking him.
Mr. Pruitt's, at least what he brings to the table as far as the position is concerned?
Oh, it's a disaster, Pedro. I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency, let's remember, was created by President Richard Nixon to be our national guardian of our environment and health. Mr. Pruitt, unfortunately, has devoted a career to siding with biggest polluters in the country to take the EPA to court to try to prevent it from doing its job. That's exactly what he's doing from the inside. And just today, Pedro, he is going out to visit one of the dirtiest coal-fired power plants in the country. It's a coal-fired power plant that puts out between 2 and 3 times as much of sulfur dioxides and nitrogen dioxides as the national average for coal plants. These are dangerous pollutants, Pedro. They cause heart attacks, asthma attacks, bronchitis, strokes, acid rain. These are horrendous pollution problems, and the fact that the EPA administrator is traveling out to showcase one of the dirtiest power plants in the country shows you exactly where his priorities are. It's about putting big polluter profits first, putting the rest of us at risk. That's not great. It's not what we voted for. We need to turn it around.
Sarah is in New Hampshire, independent line. Go ahead.
Hi, yes, I appreciate your guest topic, and I agree with what you say about the need to absolutely go after this in a way. I think my bottom line question is this. What we all understand is that it takes the resources to be committed, and to do that, there has to be an agreement from the top. And sometimes it comes from the middle range of state folks in our world up to the president, and sometimes it's the other way around. I can tell you one example is that years ago at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Maryland, before those two companies were merged, we turned off all of the IBM mainframes. And I'll tell you what age range I'm in, but I'm quite serious. My family's in medicine. I only have a PhD, 8 docs, 5 nurses. I'm very serious about this. What we had that made the difference, and this is what I would love your guest to respond to. We had a total commitment, all kinds of people thinking we should do all kinds of things. We had a total commitment down to 15 minutes of time of managing money and people. And I know that's an impossible thing in our world, so to speak, to get the mainframes off and institute an entirely new system in the world that was advancing in medicine. We did that. We did that in 3 years. 3 years.
Okay, Sarah, thank you. This idea of total commitment, Mr. Deans.
Absolutely.
At least when it comes to the climate
right.
topic.
Well, Sarah, Doctor, thank you so much for calling on that. First of all, I'll tell you who's totally committed is the fossil fuel industry, and here's what they're committed to, making sure we don't do anything to protect our children against the growing dangers of this global scourge. How do we know that? They spent $260 million last year alone promoting their agenda and their allies up here on Capitol Hill. They have an army of 700 lobbyists who get up every morning, lace up their wingtips, and go up there, twist arms and slap backs to protect their shareholders. They're not breaking laws. They have the right to do that. The rest of us need to stand up and talk about what's good for the country. And we're going to take this agenda on in the court of public opinion and in the court of law. And we're all going to have a chance to do it on April 29th, a week from Saturday, when we're all going to come out here in Washington for the climate march and show this president that we mean this, that we believe in this. We're going to stand up for clean air and water. We're going to stand up for climate justice. We're going to stand up for our children's future.
Mr. Ebell.
Well, this is really not a debate about between big bad industry and the poor little environmental pressure groups. Bob's group, the NRDC, has a budget well in excess of $100 million a year. The top 50 environmental pressure groups have a budget of $3.5 billion or so. And moreover, they're working in lockstep with big corporations, including the fossil fuel industry. ExxonMobil supports the Paris Climate Treaty. We can go through the list of the companies that support the Paris Climate Treaty. This is a battle between working people who need affordable energy and big corporations and their allies in the environmental pressure groups who hope to get rich off the backs of consumers. And that's why you're seeing more and more of a convergence between the renewable fuel industry, the climate industrial complex, and these big multinational corporations like ExxonMobil.
Well, let me say what Moody's investor firm said about that just last month, not an environmental group. Moody's put out a report last month saying that wind turbines in the Great Plains of America are now 30% cheaper than existing coal-fired power plants. And Moody's cautioned its investors that there may be 100 coal-fired power plants out in the Great Plains and Midwest that are going to be shut down because wind turbines are 30% cheaper. The price of wind and solar has plummeted. It has fallen more than 70% in just the past 7 years. So in the United States and globally, consumers are getting a break on their electricity rates, and investors are getting more money, and we're getting a cleaner energy portfolio. That's a winning solution. That's why folks like Moody's investors are bullish on renewable power.
Pedro, could I add a footnote to that? If that were true, then we don't need all of these government programs to support and mandate windmills and solar panels. If they're cheaper, they will dominate the market. So we can get rid of the federal subsidies for wind and solar. We can get rid of the state mandates for renewable energy. We can get rid of the ethanol mandate. If these things are cheaper, they're going to win. I think they might be cheaper if they get enough federal subsidies and state mandates, yes. That's a lot of the story behind this claim that they're a lot cheaper.
Could I put an asterisk on the
Yes.
footnote? What he's talking about is a 2 penny per kilowatt hour tax incentive to help promote clean, renewable, homegrown American energy right here in this country and the millions of jobs that come with it. You bet we ought to be doing that. But since my friend is offended by the idea of federal subsidies, I assume he's ready to dispense with the $5 billion a year taxpayer handout to the oil and gas industry.
Yes,
I assume he's ready to do away, and the $1 billion giveaway to the coal companies on federal lands, and the scores of billions of dollars we spend every year projecting military power to secure our access to oil and sea lanes to deliver it globally.
Let me get a response, and we got to take a call. Go ahead.
Well, we at CEI, we oppose all mandates and subsidies. We think free markets are what benefit consumers because they find they encourage innovation and they find the lowest cost solutions to what consumers want. So we're against all mandates and subsidies. We'd like to see this done on a fair way. This idea that we put all this money into the strategic and military protection of the Middle East, well, the shale oil and gas revolution has changed that picture. It's not wind and solar. It's the fact that we are now the world's largest oil and gas producer, and the sky's the limit because we have the largest resources in the world, not only of oil and gas, but also of coal.
I got to get a call. We'll get your thought in, but you just heard from Myron Ebell of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and also Bob Dean's joining us with the Natural Resources Defense Council talking about the Trump administration's climate agenda.